What happens when an HOA president treats her neighbor's boat like it's her own and freezes when the Coast Guard shines a light in her face? Blue and red lights tore across the black surface of the bay, cutting through laughter and music in an instant. The thump of bass from a portable speaker died out as someone fumbled to silence it, and for a moment all that could be heard was the low roar of the Coast Guard's motor closing in. Cynthia Weller stood at the wheel of the boat, her hands trembling, her throat tight. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't prepared for this. And now, in front of a dozen tipsy friends, she was about to be exposed. "Kill the music," one of the men muttered sharply, grabbing at a beer can and tossing it overboard. Another guest whispered, "Are they coming straight for us?" The question didn't need an answer. Every pair of eyes on that deck was already glued to the approaching lights. "Good evening, folks," a Coast Guard officer's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Cut the engine and prepare for inspection." Cynthia froze. She wasn't licensed to operate this boat. She wasn't even supposed to be on it. Her heart pounded as she fumbled with the controls, her movements clumsy and loud in the silence. The officer's beam of light swept across the deck, catching faces that suddenly looked less like party guests and more like accomplices. "What's the problem, officer?" Cynthia called out, her voice thinner than she intended. "Noise complaints," the officer replied flatly. "And a vessel operating without proper lights. Ma'am, this your boat?" That single question hung in the night air like a guillotine. Cynthia felt her knees weaken. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Around her, the laughter and arrogance of the evening evaporated, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Someone coughed. A guest muttered, "Say something." But Cynthia's lips wouldn't form the lie she had rehearsed in her head. The officer's flashlight stopped squarely on her, waiting. The Coast Guard boat pulled closer, its presence looming. "Ma'am, I'll ask again. Are you the registered owner of this vessel?" Every fiber of Cynthia's body screamed for her to answer, but she was paralyzed. The friends who had cheered her on an hour earlier now looked down, silent, as if refusing to be connected to whatever trouble was about to land. The boat rocked slightly in the water, and with it, Cynthia's sense of control slipped away completely. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had imagined laughter carrying over the waves, a sense of authority, of belonging, of being admired. Instead, here she was, cornered under harsh lights, her authority melting into humiliation. "Ma'am, we need proof of registration," the officer said again, his tone sharpening. "If you're not the owner, you'll need to explain why you're operating this vessel." Cynthia swallowed hard. She could feel her throat drying up, her palms slick with sweat. She thought of Darnell Cooper, his name printed on the documents, his careful way of polishing this boat every Saturday morning, his pride in owning something so sleek. He was in Atlanta, far from here, probably laughing with family over dinner. And she was on his boat, surrounded by incriminating stares, about to be dragged into a mess of her own making. Her mind scrambled for a way out. Maybe she could say she borrowed it with permission. Maybe she could bluff. But with the Coast Guard's light burning into her eyes, the weight of authority pressing down, Cynthia couldn't summon a single convincing word. The silence stretched. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. The officer finally broke it. "All right, ma'am. Cut the engine now. We'll handle this properly." The words struck Cynthia like a sentence being read aloud in court. She fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them, before the engine finally went quiet. The water lapped against the hull in the sudden stillness, amplifying every shallow breath she took. Her guests avoided her gaze, and one by one they seemed to fold in on themselves, realizing this night wasn't ending in laughter, but in reports, paperwork, and possible charges. The Coast Guard officers secured the boat, stepping aboard with an authority that no one dared to challenge. Cynthia's eyes darted between their stern expressions and the scattered empties rolling across the deck. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had crossed a line, and now she was trapped on the wrong side of it. But this wasn't the beginning of her fall. It was the moment her choices caught up with her. And it all started long before the flashing lights appeared on the water. But before the Coast Guard stop turned her night into a public humiliation, the story began with a neighborhood, a new HOA president, and a temptation that refused to stay quiet. 2 days earlier, the neighborhood along Mission Bay in San Diego looked like the picture of order. Houses with sharp lines and manicured lawns stood in neat rows, their trimmed hedges and polished driveways giving off a sense of quiet pride. This wasn't the sort of place where drama usually spilled out into the open, but behind closed doors, the Homeowners Association, the HOA, was its own battlefield. At the head of it all now sat Cynthia Weller, 47 years old, sharp blazer always pressed, hair tied back in a way that said she wanted control of everything she touched. Cynthia hadn't lived in the neighborhood long, but she had a knack for convincing people she was the most competent person in the room. When elections rolled around that spring, she beat out a long-standing board member and claimed the president's seat with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Neighbors described her as ambitious. Others, less politely, said she enjoyed authority too much. She organized meetings with rigid schedules, enforced rules with sudden strictness, and gave the impression that she, not the collective residents, was the one calling the shots. Across the street lived Darnell Cooper, 42, a software engineer who had been in the neighborhood for nearly a decade. Where Cynthia was loud and always pushing, Darnell was steady. He didn't say much at HOA meetings, but when he did, his words carried weight. He wasn't the kind to show off, but his boat, docked proudly in the marina just 5 minutes away, caught attention on its own. A sleek white Sea Ray Sundancer, polished weekly until it gleamed like new. Other boat owners at the marina often asked him for maintenance tips, and he gladly shared. Darnell worked hard for what he had. Weekdays were long hours in front of multiple monitors, fixing code and troubleshooting problems that would have fried someone else's patience. Weekends were his risa, cleaning the boat, taking it out on the bay, sometimes inviting close friends for a quiet ride. For him, the boat wasn't just a luxury. It was a reward, a piece of stability. That week, though, he wasn't in San Diego. He had packed a bag, locked up his home, and driven to the airport for a flight to Atlanta, where his parents lived. It was his mother's birthday, and missing it wasn't an option. He left confident everything at home would stay safe, the way it always had. And then there was Cynthia. The HOA president had noticed Darnell's boat plenty of times before. From her own yard, she could see him hitching up gear, checking the engine, wiping down surfaces until they shone. She never said it out loud, but her envy was obvious. At gatherings, her comments carried a sharp edge. "That's quite the toy you've got there, Darnell," she once remarked, her tone halfway between admiration and criticism. When she learned, through neighborhood gossip, that Darnell would be gone for the weekend, something in her clicked. She had responsibilities, yes, but the thought of responsibility melted into something else. Temptation. The marina security wasn't airtight. Residents often strolled in and out, and as HOA president, she believed she carried a certain untouchable authority. If anyone questioned her, she could flash a confident smile and explain it away. Still, temptation needed a push. That came in the form of her friend Margot Bell, a lively woman with a mischievous streak who always encouraged Cynthia's bold ideas. One glass of wine too many on Friday afternoon, and Margot leaned in with a grin. "Why don't we take that boat out?" "Just for fun." He'll never know, Cynthia laughed at first, but her mind didn't let it go. She thought about how people looked at her in meetings, half admiring, half suspicious. She thought about the power of being seen not just as the HOA president, but as someone who owned the night. And suddenly, the idea of steering Darnell's prize boat across the bay while people laughed and cheered around her felt irresistible. By Saturday afternoon, she had made her decision. She gathered a small circle of friends, people who were always ready for a thrill and never the type to ask too many questions. "Bring drinks," she instructed. "We'll head out after dark. It'll be easier then." The plan was reckless, but it had a dangerous logic to it. In her mind, she wasn't stealing. She was borrowing. Just a few hours, just one night. Darnell would never know, but temptation, once fed, never stays small. And what Cynthia saw as a harmless indulgence was about to turn into something far more humiliating than she could have imagined. But before Cynthia's bold plan played out on the open water, she first had to convince herself and her friends that sneaking onto that boat was nothing more than a little harmless fun. By the time Saturday evening rolled around, the marina at Mission Bay was alive in its own quiet way. Families returning from day trips cleaned coolers on the docks, children carried half-deflated rafts to the parking lot, and boat owners tied down their vessels for the night. The air smelled of salt, sunscreen, and barbecue smoke drifting over from the nearby park. For most, it was just another summer weekend. For Cynthia Weller, though, it was the night she had decided to blur the line between envy and entitlement. She had spent the afternoon pacing her living room, convincing herself this wasn't as outrageous as it sounded. "It's just a boat ride," she muttered more than once, sipping nervously from a glass of Chardonnay. The title of HOA president sat heavy on her shoulders, but not in the way one might expect. Instead of responsibility, she felt emboldened, almost protected. Who would dare accuse her of wrongdoing? She was the one neighbors answered to about lawn violations and parking disputes. She had authority. Or at least, she thought she did. Margot Bell, perched on the couch with her sandals kicked off, gave her the last push she needed. "You've been talking about it all day," Margot teased, swirling ice in her glass. "Either you're going to do it, or you're going to sit here regretting it while someone else is having all the fun." Cynthia smirked, though her nerves made the expression twitch at the edges. "We'll keep it small," she said finally. "Just a handful of us. One ride, a little music, nothing wild." "Nothing wild?" Margot laughed. "On that boat? Come on, Cynthia. You don't borrow a luxury car and keep it parked in the driveway. You take it out and let people see you in it." That line sank in deep. It wasn't just about the ride. It was about being seen. For Cynthia, admiration had always been a quiet hunger. When she walked through the neighborhood, she noticed glances. She lived for them. Tonight, she wanted more than polite smiles. She wanted attention, envy, whispers about how she must be living larger than anyone realized. By sunset, the group had formed. Along with Margot came her younger cousin, a wiry 20-something named Troy with more bravado than sense, and two others from Cynthia's social circle, Janet and Roland, both known for enjoying nights that pushed boundaries. They gathered in Cynthia's driveway, voices hushed but giddy, as if they were planning something half illegal, half thrilling. As they walked toward the marina, Cynthia rehearsed the lines she might use if someone questioned them. "Darnell let me take it out while he's gone. I'm just keeping it safe." But no matter how many times she practiced, the excuses sounded flimsy, stitched together with thin thread. Still, the gate at the marina clicked open under her keycard, access provided by her HOA role, not her own membership, and that sound erased hesitation. They walked down the dock, the wood planks creaking under their steps, until the Sea Ray Sundancer came into view. The boat shimmered faintly in the dim lights along the pier, spotless as always. Darnell's pride radiated from every polished surface. Cynthia paused, staring at it, and for a fleeting moment, guilt flared. She could picture him bent over this very deck, wiping it down with care. "You freezing up?" Troy asked, smirking. "No," Cynthia snapped, "just taking it in." "You don't rush into moments like this," Janet whistled low. "He keeps it cleaner than my kitchen." "You sure he's not going to notice?" "He won't," Cynthia replied, though her tone was sharper than intended. "We'll be careful." One by one they climbed aboard. The deck lights flicked on, soft and inviting, and the cabin below smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Margot's laughter broke the tension. "Well, look at you, Captain Cynthia. Feels natural, doesn't it?" Cynthia gripped the wheel, pretending confidence. She didn't know the first thing about maritime controls, but pride wouldn't let her admit it. "Of course it does," she lied smoothly. "Now help me untie us." With Troy fumbling at the ropes and Roland fiddling with the speaker, the boat shuddered, then eased away from the dock. Cynthia's chest swelled with a rush she hadn't felt in years. As the marina lights grew smaller, she could almost believe it was hers. The boat, the night, the admiring eyes of her companions. "Turn up the music!" Margot shouted, her hair whipping in the breeze. A bass-heavy track filled the air, carrying across the water. Cynthia laughed then, too loud, too wild, and for a while she forgot the weight of risk entirely. but temptation doesn't stop growing once you feed it. The boat cut deeper into the bay, music blaring, voices rising, until the sound carried back to shore and into the ears of neighbors who knew very well that Darnell Cooper was hundreds of miles away. But while Cynthia basked in the thrill of playing captain, word was already spreading along the marina that something didn't look right, and trouble had a way of finding its way onto the water. By the time the boat cleared the marina, the bay opened wide in front of them, like an invitation. The sun had dipped fully below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange fading into purple. The air cooled, but the energy on the deck only heated up. Cynthia stood tall behind the wheel, her back straighter than usual, chin slightly raised. To anyone watching, she might have looked like she belonged there. To herself, she felt like she was balancing on the edge of a cliff, terrified and exhilarated all at once. "Turn it louder!" Troy yelled, already on his third beer. He waved his arms in the air like they were at a concert, not on stolen property. The speaker thumped, bass bouncing across the water. Roland leaned against the railing, his phone out. "This is insane," he said, though his grin betrayed no worry. "I'm posting this." Cynthia spun on him so quickly the boat rocked. "You are not," she snapped. "No photos, no videos, not one." Roland held up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, fine. You're the boss, Captain." Her title dripped with sarcasm, but Cynthia clung to it anyway. "Captain?" "Yes, that's what she was tonight." Margot, always the instigator, tossed her sandals aside and danced barefoot across the deck. "Loosen up, Sin. Look at you. Running the HOA by day, running the bay by night. Tell me that doesn't feel good?" Cynthia's laugh was sharp, but genuine this time. It did feel good. Too good. The rhythm of the waves beneath her, the sound of her friends cheering. It created a heady mix. She imagined the other homeowners seeing her now, not as a rule enforcer, but as someone untouchable, someone they'd gossip about in admiration. Janet sipped from a plastic cup, her tone more cautious. "You sure you know what you're doing? Boats aren't cars. If the Coast Guard sees us, they won't." Cynthia cut her off quickly. "Relax. We're not hurting anyone. Just a little ride. Nothing more." But her words sounded thinner than she intended, because even as she said them, she knew this wasn't just a little ride. She was risking more than her reputation. She was risking exposure, humiliation, maybe worse. The group didn't notice how far they had already gone. The marina was a cluster of distant lights now, and their laughter carried freely across the bay. A passing kayak slowed, its paddler frowning at the blaring music. "Keep it down!" he shouted. Troy leaned over the railing and hollered back, "Mind your own business!" His voice echoed, and laughter followed. Cynthia forced a smile, but inside, her stomach tightened. Encounters like that could bring attention, and attention wasn't what she needed. Not from strangers who didn't know the plan, not from anyone who might remember the sight of her at the wheel. Still, the show had to go on. She grabbed the throttle with one hand, steadying the wheel with the other, and pushed them farther out. The boat surged, splitting the water, sending cheers across the deck. For a few fleeting moments, the doubt in her mind dulled beneath adrenaline. Janet edged closer, voice low enough only Cynthia could hear. "I'm serious, Sin. This could go bad fast." "You sure you want to keep going?" Cynthia didn't answer right away. Her eyes fixed on the horizon, but her thoughts were tangled. Every part of her wanted to keep pressing forward, to cling to the power she rarely felt in her day-to-day life. Being HOA president gave her a title, yes, but not this raw sense of ownership, of command. Finally, she looked at Janet and forced a smirk. "When's the last time you felt alive, Janet?" "Really alive? Tonight, that's what this is?" Janet studied her for a long moment, then stepped back, muttering, "Don't say I didn't warn you." The music pulsed again, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the deck. To anyone watching from the shore, it looked like a party in full swing. To Cynthia, it was validation. For once, she wasn't the woman neighbors whispered about behind closed doors. She was the one at the center of it all. But the water has a way of carrying noise. And while Cynthia reveled in the image she had built, the sound of their celebration drifted toward the coastline. Windows slid open in waterfront condos, annoyed residents peering out. Phone calls were made. Complaints were logged. The wrong kind of attention was already moving in their direction. Back on the boat, Cynthia took another drink and smiled as if the night was hers to command. She didn't know that somewhere on shore, a Coast Guard crew was already preparing to check out a disturbance on the bay. But as the party carried on with reckless joy, the waves were already carrying whispers of trouble straight toward them. The Sundancer cut across the bay with a steady hum, its wake spreading in long white streaks behind it. From a distance, the vessel looked like any other weekend cruiser, but the sound pouring from its speakers told a different story. Music throbbed over the waves, laughter spilled into the night, and every so often, Troy's voice rose above the rest, loud and careless. Cynthia gripped the wheel tighter than she needed to. Her friends might have seen her grin, but inside, her nerves flickered. The throttle was slippery under her palm, and every jerk of the boat reminded her that she wasn't in control. Not fully. But admitting that wasn't an option. She had built this night up too far to back down. Roland leaned near the bow, holding his cup high like a toast to the city skyline glittering in the distance. "This is living, Sin! Forget HOA meetings, you're the queen of the bay!" That word, queen, hit her like champagne bubbles rising too fast. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. For once, people weren't rolling their eyes at her strict memos or whispering about her power trips. They were looking at her with admiration, even awe. "Damn right," Troy said, swaggering across the deck with his shirt half undone. "Captain Cynthia." Running things like a boss. Captain Cynthia. She let the title roll through her mind, sweeter than the wine in her cup. But Janet wasn't laughing. She sat near the cabin steps, arms folded, eyes flicking between the shoreline and the flashing of distant lights from other vessels. "You're pushing it, Sin. Look around. Boats this size don't go unnoticed." Margot twirled in place, hair flying. "Ignore her. She's always worried about something." "You're fine, Sin. Just keep us steady." Cynthia flashed a smile, but her jaw was tight. "Relax, Janet. We're not breaking any laws." "It's just a ride," Janet raised an eyebrow. "Really? No license, no permission, open drinks, music blasting? You don't call that breaking rules?" The words dug at Cynthia, but she swallowed them down. She wouldn't let one person's fear spoil the image she had worked so hard to build tonight. "No one cares, Janet. It's the bay. Everyone's out here having fun." Yet as the words left her lips, a deep anxiety began to coil. Because everyone wasn't out there having fun. Not like this. On shore, lights flicked on in apartments facing the water. A man on his balcony scowled, his phone pressed to his ear. Two joggers on the boardwalk stopped to watch the bright boat weaving erratically. Even another boat owner, adjusting ropes at the marina, muttered, "That's Cooper's Sundancer. But that's not him at the wheel." Back on deck, Troy sloshed his drink dangerously close to the controls. "Let me steer, Sin. I've driven a jet ski before. Same thing, right?" "Sit down," Cynthia snapped, sharper than she meant. "This isn't a toy." "Neither is this party," Roland joked, raising his cup again. But when his eyes caught Cynthia's stern expression, he backed off. The music drowned the silence for a while, covering nerves with noise. Yet no one could fully shake the thought that they were dancing on the edge of something bigger than a party. The bay had its rules, and rules didn't bend easily, not even for an HOA president who thought her title gave her immunity. Cynthia stared at the horizon. The lights of Coronado Bridge twinkled in the distance, but her focus was broken when a kayak drifted near, the paddler frowning at the scene. He didn't shout this time. He simply stared for a moment, shook his head, and paddled toward shore. That look, the quiet judgment, struck Cynthia harder than Troy's teasing or Janet's warnings. It was the kind of look she had given others before, condemning, certain, and it unsettled her far more than she wanted to admit. Still, the current pulled her forward. Every laugh from her guests, every thump of the bass, every shout that carried across the water wrapped her deeper in the fantasy. She told herself she deserved this. She worked harder than most, held more responsibility than most. What was one night? What was one ride? Yet the bay had its own audience, an audience she couldn't charm or silence. because somewhere back at the Coast Guard station, reports of a noisy vessel causing disturbance near the marina were being logged. And officers, already accustomed to holiday weekend antics, were dispatched to check it out. On the Sundancer, Cynthia's confidence teetered. She masked it with laughter, with another sip, with another push of the throttle. But her guests, even Margot, felt the undercurrent. They cheered louder, danced harder, drank faster, as if drowning out the knowledge that they were pushing luck too far. For Cynthia, the night had started with envy. Now it was spinning into recklessness. And though the bay stretched endlessly in front of her, the walls around her choices were already closing in. But before the reality of consequences caught her full in the face, the flashing lights of authority were already slicing across the water, drawing closer with every second. The party ended the second the lights appeared. Blue strobes cut across the water, washing over the deck, splintering through the music like glass. At first, some of the guests thought it was another boat pulling alongside for fun, but then the megaphone crackled. "This is the United States Coast Guard! Cut your engine. Prepare for inspection." Cynthia's stomach dropped. Her hands went cold on the wheel. The speaker thumped once more before Roland fumbled to silence it, leaving only the sound of water smacking the hull. Everyone's laughter died instantly. "Are they serious?" Troy whispered, half grinning like it was still a game. Janet shot him a look. "Do they sound like they're joking?" Margot grabbed Cynthia's arm, nails digging in. "Just act natural. Say it's yours." The Coast Guard boat drew up alongside them, the officer's beam sweeping across faces, pausing on the empty bottles scattered near the stern. The silence on the Sundancer was heavy enough to choke. "Ma'am," the lead officer called, "cut your engine!" Cynthia fumbled at the controls. Her movements were jerky, unpracticed. When the engine finally sputtered quiet, the boat seemed to shrink beneath her feet. The officer's voice came again, firmer. "Are you the registered owner of this vessel?" Her throat locked. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Margot whispered urgently, "Say yes. Just say yes." But lying under that harsh spotlight felt impossible. Her mouth opened, then closed again. "Ma'am," the officer repeated. "Your name and proof of registration." I don't have it on me," Cynthia stammered. The words felt weak, small. The officer narrowed his eyes. "So you're not the owner?" Cynthia swallowed, her hands trembling on the wheel. I'm looking after it for a neighbor," she muttered, barely audible. The silence that followed was brutal. Even her friends shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her answer settling over them like an anchor. "Looking after it?" The officer's tone turned sharp. "Operating someone else's vessel without their authorization is a serious offense, especially when alcohol is involved." Roland tried to lighten the moment with a nervous laugh. "We were just, taking it around the bay. No harm done, right?" The officer cut him off cold. "Sir, this isn't a joke. Everyone stay seated." Cynthia's chest heaved. She glanced at Janet, who shook her head slowly, her eyes saying what words didn't. "This is exactly what I warned you about." Another officer climbed aboard, boots heavy against the deck. He scanned the group, then fixed his gaze on Cynthia. "Ma'am, I need your ID, now." Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped her purse as she dug for her wallet. When she handed it over, her fingers brushed his glove, clammy with fear. "Cynthia Weller," the officer read aloud, jotting it down. "And you're the HOA president out here?" Her face burned. Even in the dark, humiliation scorched her cheeks. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about being recognized, about her neighbors eventually hearing this story and watching her carefully built image collapse. Margot tried to interject. "Look, officer, it's not like she stole it. The guy's her neighbor. She was just borrowing—" The officer turned on her. "Ma'am, be quiet. Borrowing without permission is theft on the water. Do you understand that?" Silence followed. None of them dared to argue again. The inspection continued with cold precision. Officers checked compartments, scanned the deck, noted the alcohol, the lack of lights, the erratic operation. Every detail piled higher against Cynthia. Finally, the lead officer leaned closer, his tone cutting. "This vessel will be secured and returned to its rightful owner. You'll be contacted regarding charges. For tonight, You're lucky we're not hauling all of you in. Cynthia's eyes blurred. She wanted to scream at Margot for planting the idea, at Troy for his recklessness, at herself most of all. But no words came. Only the hollow echo of her choices rang in her head. Her guests sat stone still, drained of their earlier bravado. The officers stepped back onto their own boat, but the damage was already done. The Sundancer, once a symbol of envy, now felt like a stage where Cynthia's worst humiliation had just played out in front of an unflinching audience. The silence lingered even after the Coast Guard pulled away. Not one person spoke, not one dared to break the air thick with shame. Cynthia stared at the wheel, hands still trembling, the word thief pounding in her ears. She had wanted power, attention, admiration. Instead, she had ended up stripped of it all in the harshest way possible. But the confrontation wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the fallout, because word in a community spreads faster than the tide. By the time Cynthia and her guests brought the Sundancer back to the marina, the thrill had bled out of the night. They docked in silence, each step on the creaking planks heavy with the knowledge that what had happened couldn't be erased. The Coast Guard hadn't cuffed them or dragged them away, but the damage was already sealed. As Cynthia climbed off the boat, she could feel the weight of eyes on her. A few boat owners were still milling around despite the late hour, finishing their cleanups or checking their ropes. She swore she saw one man lean toward another and whisper. Her face burned, though no one said her name aloud. Margot tried to smooth it over as they walked the dock. Nobody's going to care, Cyn. Honestly, people do crazier things all the time. It's just a story. Cynthia stopped short, her voice sharp. A story? That's the problem. It's already a story. By tomorrow, half this marina will be talking about it. Roland muttered under his breath. Yeah, and none of them will forget who was at the wheel. Enough! Cynthia snapped, but her voice wavered. Janet, trailing behind, finally spoke what the others wouldn't. You should have listened. I told you this wasn't just fun and games. That man takes care of this boat like it's his child. And you treated it like a prop. Cynthia whirled on her, eyes flashing. Don't preach to me. You came along, didn't you? Janet didn't flinch. I came because I thought you'd come to your senses before it got out of hand. I was wrong. They parted ways at the parking lot. Cynthia left standing alone under the yellow glow of the streetlights. The cool night air couldn't wash away the sweat clinging to her neck. She could already picture the whispers at the next HOA meeting, the smug faces of those she had outmaneuvered in the election. Her chest tightened with dread. And she wasn't wrong. By the next morning, conversations were buzzing along the docks. A retiree named Carl Preston told his neighbor over coffee, "Saw Weller on Cooper's Sundancer last night." Coast Guard had them pulled over. She looked like a deer in headlights. At a nearby slip, a woman cleaning her deck leaned over to another boat owner. It wasn't hers. Then what was she doing behind the wheel? The story spread like gasoline meeting a spark. Each retelling grew sharper. Some said she was nearly arrested. Others claimed she tried to lie and got caught. A few added details that weren't true, but fit the picture well enough. Empty bottles, music blasting, a group too loud to ignore. By noon, Cynthia's phone was already lighting up with texts. One message read, "Heard you had quite the adventure last night. Everything okay?" Another, less polite, "Borrowing neighbors' boats now?" She didn't reply. She couldn't. At the marina office, the manager shook his head as he updated Darnell's file. "He's not going to be happy when he hears this," he muttered, sliding a note into the folder marked with Darnell Cooper's name. Even Cynthia's allies started to back away. Margot avoided calls. Roland stayed quiet online. Only Janet, in her steady way, sent a single message. "You need to own up before someone else tells him first." Cynthia stared at it for a long time, but didn't respond. Pride chained her silence, but fear was starting to eat through the links. Meanwhile, Darnell's absence only made the tension grow. Neighbors who might have let it slide if the owner had laughed it off instead speculated about how furious he'd be. Some pitied him, others were eager for the drama. But everyone agreed on one thing. Cynthia Weller had crossed a line. That evening, Cynthia pulled her blinds shut and sat alone in her living room, every tick of the clock louder than the last. She kept replaying the officer's words, the humiliation on the water, the way her friends had avoided her gaze as the lights bore down. For years, she had built her reputation as the woman in charge, the one people didn't question. Now she was the punchline to a story she couldn't control. But the real storm hadn't hit yet, because Darnell Cooper was on his way home, and the moment he learned the truth, silence would no longer protect her. When Darnell Cooper's flight touched down in San Diego late Sunday afternoon, he was still smiling from the weekend. His mother's birthday had been a success. Family gathered from 3 states, old photos pulled from boxes, laughter echoing through the house. It was the kind of trip that left him grateful and grounded. By the time he wheeled his suitcase out of the airport, he was already planning a quiet evening. Unpack, grab takeout, and maybe head to the marina the next morning to check on the Sundancer. But before he even reached his car in long-term parking, his phone buzzed with a voicemail. He didn't recognize the number, but the message was short and clipped. Mr. Cooper, this is Jerry from the marina office. We need you to stop by when you get a chance. Something happened with your vessel this weekend. Darnell froze. Something happened? His first thought was storm damage, maybe vandalism. He frowned, replaying the message. The tone didn't sound like property damage. It sounded awkward, hesitant. He drove straight to the marina. When he walked into the office, Jerry, a stout man in his 60s with sunburned skin from decades on the water, looked up from behind the counter. Darnell, he said, shifting uncomfortably. Glad you're back. Listen, we had an incident. Darnell set his jaw. What kind of incident? Jerry hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Your neighbor, Cynthia Weller. She took your boat out Friday night. Without permission, I take it? For a moment, Darnell didn't move. The words seemed to hang in the air, bouncing around his skull. She what? Coast Guard stopped her, Jerry continued quickly, lowering his voice. Noise complaints. Said she couldn't provide proof of ownership. They logged it and let her dock again. But, well, word's gotten around. Folks are talking. Darnell felt heat rise in his chest, spreading fast. His boat wasn't just a possession. It was years of work, discipline, saving every extra dollar until he could finally buy it. And she had treated it like a toy, like something she could claim just because she wore the title of HOA president. Where is she now? He asked flatly. Jerry shrugged. Home, I suppose. Look, I'm not trying to stir it up, but if I were you, I'd handle it quick. Before the gossip twists it further, Darnell nodded stiffly, turned, and left. He didn't even stop at the dock. He couldn't bring himself to see the Sundancer yet, not while the image of someone else's hands on the wheel burned in his mind. He drove straight to Cynthia's house. She was in the kitchen when the knock came, clutching a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Her stomach sank at the sound. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She opened the door anyway. There stood Darnell, arms crossed, eyes locked on hers with a sharpness that made her want to shrink. Darnell, she started weakly. You're back early. Don't. His voice was low, firm. Tell me why I had to hear from Jerry at the marina that the Coast Guard pulled my boat over Friday night. With you at the wheel. Her face flushed. Words tangled in her throat. I was just keeping an eye on things. I thought. You thought what? His voice rose, cutting through her stammer. That being HOA president gave you the right to take my property without asking? To throw a party on it like it was yours? Margot's words echoed in Cynthia's head. Say it's yours. Just say it's yours. But there was no lie strong enough to hold under his stare. I didn't mean for it to go that far, she murmured. It was supposed to be harmless. Harmless? Darnell stepped closer, his anger controlled but sharp. The Coast Guard logged it. They documented you operating without a license. They saw the alcohol. That doesn't just go away. You humiliated yourself, and you dragged my name into it. Cynthia's hand tightened on the doorframe. I made a mistake. No, he said coldly. You made a choice. And you don't get to shrug it off because you're embarrassed now. Her eyes flicked down, but he didn't let her retreat. You know what the worst part is, he said after a pause, his tone heavier now. I trusted this neighborhood. I never worried when I left. And you, of all people, are the one who broke that. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. I'll fix it, she whispered. I'll make it right. Darnell shook his head slowly. You can't fix this with words. You can't fix it with an apology. You've lost something bigger than that. You've lost respect. And in this neighborhood, once that's gone, it doesn't come back. He turned and walked down her driveway, leaving her frozen in the doorway, her coffee mug trembling in her hand. As he drove away, Darnell knew this wasn't just about a boat. It was about trust, about boundaries, about entitlement dressed up as authority. And for Cynthia, the real punishment wouldn't come from him. It would come from the community watching her fall. But the fallout wouldn't stay private. The HOA meetings and neighborhood whispers were about to turn Cynthia's mistake into a spectacle she couldn't control. By Monday evening, the neighborhood that Cynthia once ruled with memos and meetings had turned into a courtroom without walls. Every driveway, every front porch, every quiet chat at the marina carried her name, and not in the way she had once hoped. At the corner house, a couple who'd lived there 20 years sipped coffee and shook their heads. She thought she was untouchable, the husband said. Now she's the punchline. HOA president caught stealing a boat. Can you imagine? Across the street, two mothers watched their kids ride scooters and whispered about the scene at the bay. My sister's friend was on the dock, one said. Saw the Coast Guard pull them over. Said Cynthia just froze. Couldn't even answer when they asked if it was hers. By Tuesday morning, the story was everywhere. Repeated, reshaped, exaggerated. In some versions, Cynthia had been handcuffed. In others, the Coast Guard had to tow the boat back because she couldn't steer. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was the humiliation stamped to her name. When the HOA board gathered midweek in the clubhouse, the air felt electric with anticipation. Usually, only a handful of residents showed up for the monthly meeting. This time, nearly 36 chairs were filled, people lining the walls, waiting. Cynthia walked in with her binder pressed to her chest like a shield. She wore the same blazer she had worn the day she won the presidency, but the fabric felt heavier, the fit tighter. Murmurs rippled as she took her seat at the front. The vice president, a soft-spoken man named Harold Benton, cleared his throat. We'll begin with old business. But someone from the back cut him off. Forget old business. We need to talk about this weekend. A chorus of agreement rose instantly. Cynthia straightened, forcing her voice steady. If we could keep order. No, a woman near the front snapped. You don't get to demand order after what you did. You embarrassed this community. You embarrassed all of us. A man stood, crossing his arms. My cousin works at the marina. Do you know how fast your little stunt spread? They're laughing at us. You were supposed to represent this neighborhood, and you turned it into gossip fodder. Cynthia tried to interject. I understand emotions are high, but— High? Another voice barked. You stole from your neighbor. That's not high emotions, that's fact. Margot, seated near the back, lifted a hand as if to defend her. She didn't steal. Oh, be quiet, someone snapped at her. You were on the boat, too. You're just as guilty. The room buzzed louder, anger thickening the air. Cynthia's fingers tightened around her binder until her knuckles whitened. She had faced confrontations before, but never like this, never with the entire room united against her. Finally, Harold raised his voice, something he rarely did. Enough. We'll address this formally. Cynthia, the board has received requests for your resignation. Do you wish to respond? Silence fell. Every eye fixed on her. She felt her throat close, her chest tighten. Resignation. The word sliced through the last shred of authority she thought she held. She looked out at the faces. Neighbors she'd bossed around about trash bins, lawns, parking. Some had despised her strictness. Others had tolerated it. But none of them respected her now. I made a mistake, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have taken that boat. I let my judgment slip, and A voice cut her off. You didn't let judgment slip. You thought you were above us, that's the truth. Her words faltered. She knew they were right. She had thought her title made her immune. She had believed authority meant ownership, even over what wasn't hers. Harold leaned forward. Cynthia, will you resign? Her eyes dropped to the binder in her lap. She thought of the hours she'd spent pushing herself into this role, the power she had craved, the admiration she had tried to force. And then she thought of the Sundancer, gleaming under Darnell's careful hands, and how easily she had trashed something precious just to feel important. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Yes, I resign." Gasps and murmurs filled the room, but underneath them was something heavier. Satisfaction. Cynthia gathered her binder, stood, and walked out without looking back. The night air hit her face, cool and sharp, but it didn't clear the heaviness in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't in charge. She wasn't feared. She wasn't admired. She was stripped bare, left only with the weight of her own choices. Inside, the meeting went on without her, the community already moving past her presence. Outside, Cynthia stood alone under the street lamp, realizing that losing her title wasn't the real punishment. The real punishment was knowing she had built her identity on authority, and now she had none left. But while Cynthia tried to swallow the bitter taste of public downfall, the moral of her story was already taking shape, because mistakes made in arrogance rarely stay private, and consequences always come home. For the rest of that week, Cynthia Weller stayed indoors, curtains drawn, lights dim. She avoided the mailbox, avoided the marina, avoided the neighborhood she once controlled with a clipboard in her hand. Every knock at the door made her stomach knot. Every ping of her phone felt like another reminder of how fast a reputation could collapse. Her resignation spread quickly, but not faster than the story itself. By Friday, Cynthia's name wasn't just whispered in driveways, it was cemented in the neighborhood's memory as a cautionary tale. At the marina, people pointed to the Sundancer and shook their heads, telling newcomers, "That's the boat she thought she could take." At HOA gatherings, her name became shorthand for arrogance, and in the quiet moments of her own home, Cynthia replayed the night again and again, trying to find the moment she could have turned back. Across the street, Darnell kept to himself. He didn't throw accusations or stir gossip. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than words. He spent Saturday morning on the dock, polishing the Sundancer the way he always had. Neighbors passed and offered small nods of respect, not pity. They knew the truth. He hadn't lost anything that mattered. His boat was intact, his reputation untouched. Cynthia was the only one who walked away diminished. Late that afternoon, Cynthia finally gathered the courage to cross the street. She found Darnell at the marina, rag in hand, the sun glinting off the spotless deck. "Darnell," she began, her voice fragile. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were calm, but they held no warmth. "What do you need, Cynthia?" She swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize, truly. I can't take back what I did, but I can at least say I'm sorry." He set the rag down, leaning on the railing. "Do you know why this hurts?" he asked evenly. "It's not the Coast Guard. It's not the gossip. It's because I trusted you. We all did. You thought your title meant permission, but titles don't give you character. Choices do." The words landed heavier than any shout. Cynthia blinked back tears, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. He was right. "I don't hate you," Darnell continued. "But I don't trust you, and trust, once broken, isn't easy to rebuild." For a long moment, Cynthia stood there, the hum of boats in the background, the weight of her mistake pressing down. Finally, she nodded, turned, and walked back up the dock, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The neighborhood never fully welcomed her back. She stayed on. Yes, her house remained, her name still on the mailbox. But her presence was different. Where once she had walked with authority, now she carried quiet. People didn't fear her rules anymore. They pitied her downfall. And maybe that was the real lesson, because authority without respect is nothing more than a mask, and masks always crack. Cynthia had learned that the hard way. That one reckless night could undo years of image building. She had reached for admiration through shortcuts, and instead, she earned isolation. Darnell, meanwhile, became the quiet hero of the story, not because he sought it, but because he represented what the community valued: respect, responsibility, trust. He didn't demand recognition. He simply lived it, and people noticed. The story of the Sundancer became a neighborhood parable, retold with a shake of the head, a reminder that arrogance sinks faster than any boat. And that's the life lesson worth carrying. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. When you treat what belongs to others as if it's yours, you don't just take property, you take trust. And trust is priceless. So ask yourself, what kind of reputation are you building right now? One that leans on titles or one that stands on character? If this story made you stop and think, remember this. Every choice writes a story about who you are. Make yours one worth repeating. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, where real choices lead to real consequences, and the lessons last longer than the gossip.